dystopia to prevail. Therefore, we must learn from our mistakes. For much of the past half-century, we tried to win the CCP over with honey, with engagement, believing that economic engagement in particular would lead naivety while they took advantage of our good faith. But that era of wishful thinking is over. The Select Committee will not allow the CCP to lull us into complacency or maneuver us into submission. Tonight we're joined by a distinguished group of dissidents in the audience, including Wei Jingcheng, a titan of the Chinese democracy movement. You will hear some of their voices momentarily in a video that looks at some of the suffering the Chinese Communist Party has inflicted since it came to power over 70 years ago. This should remind us at all times and in all the work that we do together that we must constantly distinguish between the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese people themselves, who have always been the party's primary victims. And now I would like to introduce a joint video that the ranking member and I put together to help set the stage for the hearing. Without objection, the video shall be entered into the record, and the clerk will play the video.
Forward, Chairman Mao's totalitarian China will collectivize, industrialize, impossible quotas, abusive bureaucracy. The deadliest famine in history sweeps the Chinese countryside. Tens of millions suffer excruciating death of starvation.
1966, Mao's Cultural Revolution purged opposition from society through struggle sessions and public executions. In Guangxi, over 100,000 people were slaughtered. Some were stoned, buried alive, or in the cases of over 130 people, literally eaten by crazed Maoists. 1989, students' protests in Beijing's Tiananmen Square. 250,000 PLA troops stormed the city. Beijingers threw their bodies in front of convoys to slow them. Thousands of protesters and innocent citizens were killed.
1997, the Hong Kong handover. The CCP promises one country, two system for 50 years. But in 2020, the national security law made that promise into a farce. Journalists are jailed. The opposition is silenced. Democracy activists are arrested, harassed, forced into exile, or even worse.
Today, the Communist Party of China has forcibly separated 1 million Tibetan children from their families and sent to colonial boarding schools where any trace of their culture and identity is forbidden. The Dalai Lama has called the sinicization of Tibet cultural genocide. Since 2009, 157 Tibetans have self-immolated to protest the CCP's repression.
Today, the CCP turns the Xinjiang region into a high-tech open-air prison for the millions of Uyghurs there. Some packed off to forced labor camps, while new male so-called relatives move in with their families. Unlucky Uyghurs, if found with the Quran or the wrong smartphone app, are thrown in mass detention centers. Torture, rape, forced sterilization, forced abortion, forced IUD insertion, the largest birth rate drop in UN records. A twisted new form of genocide.
Today, the party monopolizes truth. The CCP employs millions of censors. Even the Bible is rewritten. Speak out and risk disappearing. Whether you are a doctor warning of COVID, a billionaire tech executive, a tennis player testifying to sexual assault, or an activist campaigning for gay rights, AI-powered societal control techniques, brutally perfected in Xinjiang, roll out to broader China during the zero-COVID lockdowns. Tracking, surveillance, camps, families welded into their homes, left to burn alive in fires in the name of public health.
Each of these stains on human history was perpetrated by the same paranoid, thuggish, genocidal organization, the Chinese Communist Party.
One brave protester stands alone on a bridge in Beijing and gives voice to the country's frustrations. The authorities disappear him, but his words touch off a wildfire of protest as the people of China call for their human rights to be respected.
I now recognize the Ranking Member, Raja Krishnamurthy, for his opening statement.
Good evening, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's an honor to serve as the Ranking Member of this Select Committee and to join the Chairman and my colleagues in a bipartisan effort to address the economic, security, and technology challenges our country faces from the Chinese Communist Party, also known as the CCP. I believe three overarching themes will underpin our success as a committee. First, we must always protect American values and interests. Second, at our best, this committee can help us as Americans to up our game as a people. For example, through investments in technologies of the future, workforce improvement, and by fixing weaknesses in our economy, such as in our supply chains and even our legal immigration system. Third, we must practice bipartisanship and avoid anti-Chinese or Asian stereotyping at all costs. We must recognize that the CCP wants us to be fractious, partisan, and prejudiced. In fact, the CCP hopes for it. But what they don't get is that the diversity of our viewpoints and backgrounds is not a bug in America's operating system. It is our defining feature and strength. As Nancy Pelosi, for whom this room is named, has said, our diversity is our strength and our unity is our power. Our unity of purpose, our unity in action, and our unity as Americans. We must summon that unity if we're to safeguard our values and our economic way of life going forward. Over the last 3 decades, both Democrats and Republicans underestimated the CCP and assumed that trade and investment would inevitably lead to democracy and greater security in the Indo-Pacific region, including in the PRC. Instead, the opposite happened. As China's economy has grown more than tenfold since gaining access to U.S. and world markets, the CCP has, among other things, strengthened its authoritarian control at home, including engaging in a genocide of the Uyghur people. The CCP has funded a massive military buildup, threatening its neighbors, including Taiwan, and it has pursued economic and trade policies that flat out undermine our economy. The goal of the CCP has become clear: to displace U.S. and other competitors, especially in tomorrow's strategic industries. As Chairman Xi himself recently said, quote, "The East is rising while the West is declining," close quote. And by 2049, a mere 25 years away, which would mark the 100th anniversary of the birth of the People's Republic of China, Chairman Xi wants to ensure that China, quote, "leads the world in terms of strength, national composite strength, and international influence." As a committee, we must use the insights we learn here today to make our country stronger at home and more secure in the world. Here are some principles I respectfully submit for our consideration. First, we must continue to invest in high technology sectors of the future and boost U.S. manufacturing. The CHIPS and Science Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law were a strong start, but more work needs to be done. Second, we must deter the aggression by the CCP. We do not want a war with the PRC, not a Cold War, not a hot war. We don't want a clash of civilizations, but we seek a durable peace, and that is why we have to deter aggression. Last August, I joined Speaker Pelosi and my colleagues in visiting Taipei to show support for the people of Taiwan. Together, we demonstrated that the CCP will not be allowed to dictate Taiwan's security or ours. Third, we must strengthen our global partnerships and coalitions, not only to counter the CCP's security challenges, but also to address its anti-competitive economic policies. Finally, we have no quarrel with the Chinese people or people of Chinese origin. That's why we should never engage in anti-Chinese or anti-Asian stereotyping or prejudice. Comments that question the loyalty of Asian American members of Congress are completely unacceptable and must be rejected. These comments only feed the scapegoating and targeting of Chinese Americans, further endangering them and other Asian Americans. Indeed, this xenophobia and stereotyping, as I mentioned before, is what the CCP would want to happen. The CCP is counting on us to be divided. We must rise to the occasion and prove them wrong. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. If any other member wishes to submit a statement for the record, without objection, those statements will be added to the record. There being none, we are privileged today to have an all-star lineup of witnesses, each of whom brings an important and unique perspective on the Chinese Communist Party. First is Matthew Pottinger, a fellow Marine who I first met in the desert in western Iraq, who has graciously and patiently converted a recovering Arabist to a China watcher. He served as Deputy National Security Advisor under President Trump and now serves as Chairman of the China Program at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, among other affiliations. Next is Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster, who had a distinguished military career, is also a distinguished historian. His book, Dereliction of Duty, remains among the all-time classics in terms of histories of the Vietnam War, and his service to our nation culminated most recently as National Security Advisor during the previous administration. He is now the Fuad and Michelle Ajami Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution. We're also very privileged to be joined by Ms. Tong Yi, who, as you will soon hear, has an incredibly moving personal story to tell. Without spoiling anything, let me just say that there are few people who are better equipped to speak on a personal level about the true nature of the Chinese Communist Party. We are honored to have you here. And finally, we have Scott Paul, who is president of the Alliance for American Manufacturing. Mr. Paul is a true expert on manufacturing policy, and few are better equipped to speak on the CCP's malign economic practices and their consequences for American industry and American workers than him. Welcome to all of you, and thank you all for being here this evening. If you could please stand and raise your right hand, I will now swear you in. Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you are about to give is true and correct to the best of your knowledge, information, and belief, so help you God? You may be seated. Let the record show that the witnesses have answered in the affirmative, and Mr. Pottinger, you may begin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As part of my opening remarks, I'd like to enter into the record a video that has been provided to the committee.
Without objection, the video will be entered into the record. The clerk will play the video.
It is hard to let go of the myth we hold about China's rulers and their intentions. Sometimes it helps to listen to China's leaders in their own words. Myth number 1. The Chinese Communist Party is communist in name only.
我志愿加入中国共产党。
我志愿加入中国共产党。
保守党的秘密。
保守党的秘密。
为共产主义奋斗终生。
为共产主义奋斗终生。
Capitalism will inevitably perish, and socialism will inevitably triumph. Myth number 2. Beijing is not seeking to spread its own autocratic model or upend the liberal international order.
同志们，今天我们纪念马克思，是为了向人类历史上最伟大的思想家致敬。马克思主义不是书斋里的学问，而是为了改变人民历史命运而创立的。坚守共产党人的理想信念，像马克思那样为共产主义奋斗终身。
All mankind needs a new order that surpasses and supplants the balance of power. A new world order is now under construction that will surpass and supplant the Westphalian system. Myth number 3. Beijing is not pursuing a zero-sum competition with democracies or new Cold War.
中国式现代化打破了现代化等于西方化的迷思， 展现了现代化的另一幅图景，拓展了发展中国家走向现代化的路径选择，为人类对更好社会制度的探索提供了中国方案。
Xi Jinping has emphasized that our state's ideology and social system are fundamentally incompatible with the West. She has said this determines that our struggle and contest with Western countries is irreconcilable, so it will inevitably be long, complicated, sometimes even very sharp. To use war as means to protect our core national interests is not in contradiction with the path of peaceful development. Moreover, it is a manifestation of the Marxist view of warfare.
中国人民也绝不允许任何外来势力欺负、压迫、奴役我们。谁妄想这样干，必将在14多亿中国人民用血肉铸成的钢铁长城面前碰得头破血流。
Chairman Gallagher, Ranking Member Krishnamurthy, and distinguished members of the Select Committee, if any of the Xi Jinping quotations that I just displayed in that short film surprised you, you're far from alone. And that's because China's communist leaders are masters at disguising their true intentions. Those quotes you heard, some of them from previously secret speeches and from military textbooks, are just a few reflections of what China's communist leaders really think. The success that the Chinese Communist Party once enjoyed presenting itself as constructive, cooperative, responsible, normal was one of the great magic tricks of the modern era. Leader Xi Jinping might actually agree on that point. He refers to the party's influence in propaganda activities as a magic weapon for advancing the regime's interests. You could say that the Chinese Communist Party is the Harry Houdini of Marxist-Leninist regimes, the David Copperfield of communism, the Chris Angel of autocracy. But the magic is fading. There's really no excuse anymore for being fooled about Beijing's intentions, and the canon of Chairman Xi's publicly available statements is too voluminous and the accumulated actions of his regime too brazen to be misunderstood at this late hour. We simply know too much. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today.
Thank you, Mr. Pottinger. General McMaster, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Ranking Member Krishnamurthy, and distinguished members of the committee, it is a privilege to testify before this committee at this critical moment for our nation and the free world. And it is an honor to be seated next to three people for whom I have tremendous admiration and respect. This committee's work is urgent and important because the United States has fallen behind in the consequential competition with the Chinese Communist Party. For too long, leaders across the private sector, in academia, industry, and finance, as well as in the public sector across multiple administrations and Congresses, clung to the assumption that China, having been welcomed into the international system, would play by the rules, and as China prospered, would liberalize its economy and its form of governance. Reality proved otherwise, but many leaders were slow to overcome wishful thinking and self-delusion concerning the intentions of the CCP. As a result, the United States and other nations across the free world underwrote the erosion of their competitive advantages through the transfer of capital and technology to a strategic competitor determined to gain preponderant economic and military power. This committee can help the United States catch up in the competition with the CCP. It can do so by holding hearings that reveal the nature of the CCP aggression and what is at stake for Americans and citizens of the free world. And perhaps most important, the committee can help determine the combinations of policies and legislation necessary to counter CCP aggression and rebuild America's and the free world's competitive advantages.
General McMaster, why don't you pause for a second? You'll be given additional time, and we'll take care of this.
Surrounding China with more the Philippines, the people of Guam and Hawaii, their people, their land, their water, and employment, free cooperation, not competition.
All right, General McMaster, you may continue.
Thank you. This committee, as I was saying, can help the United States.
It's about saber rattling. It's not about peace. We need cooperation.
Your sign is upside down.
It's the biggest threat to this country and the world. We need to address that with China.
Well, thank you, Congressman Gallagher. I think these eruptions are indicative of really the effect that the United Front Work Department has had, and maybe we can talk more about that during the course of the hearing. I think they have reinforced to some degree what you might call a bit of a curriculum of self-loathing that has taken hold in academia for many years. They reinforce, I think, the idea that America is the problem in the world, and only if America disengages, or in this case becomes more passive, that things will get better. But the reality is that this committee's work is really important because we have to catch up, mainly because of the complacency that you hear reflected maybe in an extreme way in these two outbursts. But we have to catch up in the competition with the CCP. And as I was saying, I think what you'll be able to do is hold hearings that reveal the true nature of CCP aggression and what is at stake for Americans and citizens of the free world and the people of China. And perhaps most important, this committee can help determine the combinations of policies and legislation necessary to counter CCP aggression and rebuild America's and the free world's competitive advantages. The one-year anniversary of Russia's brutal reinvasion of Ukraine and the degree to which the CCP has covered for its authoritarian partner adds a sense of urgency to your vitally important work. And I'm confident that the committee will help our government, as well as leaders in the private sector, understand the implications of the war against Ukraine for the competition with the CCP and the urgent actions we must take to restore and preserve peace, promote prosperity, and build a better future for generations to come. Thank you for the privilege of being with you and for the bipartisan spirit in which you have undertaken this important work for the American people.
Thank you, General General McMaster, and apologize for the interruption. I should not have told him that his sign was upside down, I guess.
I've experienced worse, Congressman Gallagher.
Yeah,
okay.
I know you have. Ms. Tong, you are recognized for your opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, ranking member, distinguished member of the committee.
Would you please turn your microphone on?
Mr. Chairman, ranking member, distinguished members of the committee, it's a privilege to be here. In late November of last year, students and others in several large Chinese cities gathered in spontaneous protest. On the surface, they were angry about a lethal fire in a high-rise apartment building in the city of Urumqi in Xinjiang, but their real protest was against the lockdowns that Xi Jinping's zero-COVID policy has imposed on hundreds of millions of people. At an even deeper level, the young people were protesting a political system that could allow the whim of one muddle-headed dictator to cause such harm. The students' protests resonated deep in society. Stop the ridiculous anti-COVID tyranny. The challenge to Xi Jinping was how to change the COVID policy but keep the tyranny. He did both. The November 2022 protests were but the latest bubbling to the surface of this discontent that has lain beneath the surface of Chinese Communist society ever since 1949. The Chinese people have shown repeatedly that communist rule has been a problem for them. 3 decades ago, in 1989, I myself was a student protester. I witnessed the killings of the innocent people by the PLA near Tiananmen Square on that fateful night of June 3rd and 4th. Many others more experienced and articulate than I could be sitting here before you, but cannot risk harm to themselves or their families, especially those with relatives in China. I stayed active in pro-democracy work, and in 1993 began assisting and interpreting for Wei Jingsheng, a leading dissident who had been released as part of the CCP's bid for the 2000 Summer Olympic Games. Wei was urging the US to condition trade on China's human rights performance. I interpreted for his meetings with then Senator John Kerry, Congressman Chris Smith, and Assistant Secretary of State John Shattuck. Our meeting with Ms. Shattuck alarmed the regime, and we were arrested soon afterward. In the detention center in Beijing, in the wee hours of many consecutive mornings, police interrogated me about what Wei Jingsheng had said to the US dignitaries. They were truly afraid that the US might listen to Wei. You can imagine my disappointment when I heard on a loudspeaker inside my detention cell that President Clinton had decided to de-link the issues of human rights and trade. I was handed a 2.5 years sentence for disturbing social order and sent to a forced labor camp. In the labor camp, the food was poor, and we worked 12 hours a day, technically illegal under Chinese law. I protested, and for that, the camp authorities organized other inmates to beat me up. The beatings were terrible for 2 nights, then tapered off. Eventually, I was able, with the help of a fellow inmate, to smuggle a note about my condition out to my mother, who faxed it to a human rights organization in New York. Voices of America broadcast the story. Other media picked it up. Mr. Shattuck asked for me on his next trip to Beijing. And with all that, my treatment in the camp improved dramatically. From my own experience, I can say this with certainty. Those who have been arrested or disappeared will want us who live on the outside, here in freedom, to shout about their injustice as loudly as we can. I can also say, based on what happened to me and many others, that our shouting will likely improve their condition, not hurt it. In the US, we need to face the fact that we have helped to feed the baby dragon of the CCP until it has grown into what it now is. Since the 1990s, US companies have enriched themselves by exploiting cheap labor in China and have in the process also enriched the CCP. The regime has acquired tools for its digital dictatorship from the US through forced transfers, by theft, and sometimes with the blessings of US companies by purchasing it. Wall Street, through its passive investment portfolios, sends billions of dollars from the retirement accounts of ordinary Americans to the discretionary use of the CCP. It didn't have to be this way. After the June 4th massacre in 1989, George H.W. Bush did not have to undermine Western sanctions on Beijing by secretly sending emissaries to assure Deng Xiaoping that nothing important had happened. In 1994, Bill Clinton did not have to sell out human rights to business interests by abruptly delinking the two. In 2001, the U.S. did not have to give the CCP the undeserved and later cynically abused boon of WTO membership. We are seeing now the consequences of these policy choices. Under Xi Jinping's rule, there is increasing oppression inside China, increasing aggressiveness outside of China, and an enormous U.S. trade deficit. I am a proud immigrant citizen of the U.S., and I want my country to do better. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much, Ms. Tong. Mr. Paul, you are now recognized for your opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, members of the committee, and fellow witnesses. I appreciate the opportunity to testify. I think it's worth bear saying that those protesters have a right to an unlimited amount of free speech in the United States and to petition their government for the redress of grievances. They'd have no such right in China. It wouldn't be broadcast. Their voices would be silenced, perhaps permanently. The economic policies of the Chinese Communist Party represent a clear and present danger to the American worker, our innovation base, and our national security. For decades, the CCP has telegraphed its intentions with 5-year plans, the Made in China 2025 program, military-civil fusion, and the Belt and Road Initiative. Its goals to dominate key industries, set global standards, seek opportunity from crisis, and weaken competitors. The CCP has attracted American investment to do this, and I now ask consent to play a video. U.S. big company investment in China grew tenfold in 2 decades, $1.3 trillion in total. Their R&D in China grew at nearly 3 times the domestic rate. Cheating is a core tenet of CCP ambition, stealing intellectual property, cyber hacking, piracy. The cost, tens of thousands of factory closures in America, $600 billion in IP losses alone. The CCP also created an impossibly cheap China price that masks the true cost of production. It made China the world's factory floor, trillions in subsidies, currency manipulation, exploiting workers and the environment, even using forced labor, lax safety standards that harmed our consumers. I ask consent to roll the next graphic. Overproducing at state-owned zombie factories that just wouldn't die, and roiling global markets. The CCP demands the complicity of global businesses operating in China, and these firms have conformed. Big tech, Hollywood, sports leagues, retail legends all say the right things in America, but are silent in China, bending the knee to the CCP. Meanwhile, Chinese firms must support the military ambitions of the People's Liberation Army through the CCP's fusion strategy. No business is untainted. While CCP policies have been destructive, our own policies in some cases have made matters worse. Bringing China into the World Trade System in 2000 seemed like a slam dunk, but instead became a spectacular failure of conventional wisdom and elite opinion. And after writing a blank check to Beijing, we turned a blind eye to its cheating, time and time again, accepting empty promises to reform with no real consequences. Governors sought out Chinese firms for projects that cost American jobs. The San Francisco Bay Bridge, rail cars for Boston, Chicago, and other cities. Even the Alexander Hamilton Bridge in New York City, named for the father of American manufacturing policy. Meanwhile, taxpayer-financed federal research was handed to China. One example, a breakthrough battery was invented at a U.S. national lab, but made in China. American workers suffered as a consequence. The trade deficit surged, 3.7 million jobs vanished, wages plunged, communities were wrecked. The China import shock led to more deaths of despair and evidence of social unraveling. America became too dependent on China for many essential goods. Think of PPE during the pandemic, 5G hardware, commercial drones, critical minerals, medicine. The list is long and terrifying. At the same time, U.S. manufacturing capabilities eroded. The defense industrial base weakened. We're behind the curve on clean energy manufacturing. We couldn't make enough semiconductor chips, which broke supply chains. It doesn't have to be this way, and thankfully, U.S. policy has started to shift. Here's what we should do next. Build on the highly effective semiconductor technology export restrictions, vigorously enforce the new law called UFLPA that bans forced labor imports, sharpen trade tools, pass the bipartisan Leveling the Playing Field Act 2.0, taking trade actions to accelerate the return of key supply chains, reform the de minimis policy that gives Chinese shopping apps such as Temu and Shein, as well as Amazon, a way to evade inspections and tariffs. Screen the outbound investments of U.S. companies in China and tighten up oversight of Chinese investments in the U.S., particularly in critical sectors. Expand the law that now bans Chinese firms from federal transit contracts to all other public investment streams. We must also build on the CHIPS Act, infrastructure law, and energy investments to reduce our dependency on China. Finally, we should suspend or revoke normalized trade relations with China. The CCP certainly doesn't deserve the same trade status as our allies and reciprocal partners. In closing, our hubris and neglect aided Beijing's ambitions, weakened our capabilities, and hollowed out our middle class. But a brighter future for American manufacturing is possible, even in the wake of the CCP's destructive policies. Factories are rebounding, and it's not accidental. It's a result of public policies and pressure on corporations to rethink their supply chains. But there's more to do. We have a long list of vulnerabilities, starting with medicine ingredients, critical minerals, machine tools, and microelectronics, and the CCP isn't slowing down. While conflict with China isn't inevitable, fierce economic competition is. We look forward to working with you on building a new American strategy to defend our workers. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Paul. I commend all of our witnesses' written testimony. They are all exceptional. We will now move on to the question portion. I recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Pottinger, few issues have received as much bipartisan attention recently as TikTok. Could you elaborate on your concerns, both in terms of potential espionage, control over the algorithm, as well as potential precedent a mitigation agreement could set when it comes to TikTok and other CCP-directed technology companies operating in the United States?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Well, certainly the data privacy issues, which have gotten a lot of attention, are a real problem for the privacy of Americans, but also for our national security. Already, the Chinese parent company that controls TikTok has been confirmed as having used the app to surveil U.S. journalists in order to try to identify their sources and to retaliate against their sources. And that's just one small example of the universe of potential abuse that would be in the offing. Look, there's nothing in Chinese law that suggests that the Chinese Communist Party would back off of its legislated privilege to access all of the data produced by social media platforms and other Chinese apps. I simply don't think that it's possible to mitigate in a credible way against that threat. But the bigger coup for the Chinese Communist Party, if TikTok is permitted to continue operating in the United States, and if WeChat and other Chinese platforms are allowed to continue to operate, is that it gives the Chinese Communist Party the ability to manipulate our social discourse, the news, to censor and suppress or to amplify what tens of millions of Americans see and read and experience and hear through their social media app. TikTok is already one of the most powerful media companies in American history. and it's still growing. It's not just dances and kids stuff. It's becoming a major source of news for a generation of Americans.
Thank you, Mr. Pottinger. General McMaster, in your written testimony, you write that 1 year later, we might ask ourselves what more we could have done to deter a Russian invasion of Ukraine. What lessons from the failure of deterrence in Ukraine can we apply to Taiwan?
Congressman Gallagher, thank you very much. I think, first of all, hard power matters. And what matters much, much more than pledges of more capabilities on the ground and integrated, in this case with the Taiwanese armed forces. As all of you know, there is a $19 billion backlog of what the Taiwanese have already purchased to make that island indigestible and to achieve deterrence by denial, by convincing the People's Liberation Army and the Chinese Communist Party they cannot accomplish their objectives through the use of force. I think the other big lesson that we've been talking about, and certainly Mr. Paul talked about, is it's a big mistake to give an authoritarian regime coercive power over your economy. Germany learned that the hard way in the energy sector, and Europe did broadly in connection with the Kremlin and Russia. But there are all sorts of supply chain vulnerabilities associated with batteries, magnets, certain minerals, and the upstream processes of producing those minerals, and many of the equipment and hardware and upstream components that are critical to the energy transition, for example. So we could be creating a form of energy dependency on the Chinese Communist Party, for example. And then finally, I think what's really important is the need for us to recognize that we have to build our defense capabilities. The assumptions that have underpinned defense planning for a long time have been that we can do one thing at a time. And I think what China has been able to do is take advantage of crises elsewhere to advance their interests through coercion in other places, whether it's bludgeoning Indian soldiers to death on the Himalayan frontier or building islands and fortifying them in the South China Sea to control the ocean, or at least a part of the ocean through which 1/3 of the world's surface trade flows. So I think there are really clear lessons from Russia's reinvasion of Ukraine. But I think lesson maybe number one that is above all of these is urgency, that we have to, I think, act with a real sense of urgency.
Thank you, General McMaster. I don't have time for another question. I'll use what time remains to explain how I feel about the 5-minute rule on this committee. I will enforce it among our members gently in the first hearing and then ruthlessly thereafter, because I've spent most of my time at the far end of the low dais, and so I know that you can spend hours waiting to ask a question. That being said, if you are the eager student that stays until the end, I will entertain a second round of questioning. So you may find yourself alone with me and the witnesses at 1 a.m. asking endless rounds of question if you are so interested in the topic. And with that, I will stop talking and recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you please put up the slide with the graphic? Mr. Paul, I wanted to just bring your attention to this particular graphic. It's titled Manufacturing Employment and the U.S. Trade Deficit with PRC from 1973 to 2015. You see two lines on that graph, right? The top line actually tracks manufacturing employment over time between 73 and 2015. It starts out at roughly 18.8 or 19 million American jobs in manufacturing, and it goes all the way down to about 12.4 million jobs in 2015. You see that, right?
Absolutely, yes, sir.
And at the same time, we see the trade deficit. It starts out at 0 in 1973 because that's when we really began trading with the People's Republic of China after a long embargo before that. But then it gradually rises until we reach about $367 billion in trade deficit, meaning they're selling $367 billion more in stuff than we are selling to them, right?
Correct.
And you see that it's gradually increasing in the 1980s, the 1990s, and then all of a sudden in 2000, an event happens, at which point, all of a sudden, manufacturing employment falls off a cliff, and the trade deficit rises dramatically upward. Talk to us about what happened in 2000.
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's a product of some of the features that I mentioned in my testimony. First of all, U.S. policy liberalized trade with China through the grant of PNTR, which reduced tariffs to virtually zero. We opened up investment into China with that guarantee, and as I mentioned, we saw $1.3 trillion of foreign direct investment in China by U.S. companies over that period of time. Put simply, it displaced American workers. What we were once producing here was now being produced in China, and I'm certain that you and your colleagues saw that reflected in your communities. There were factories all over the place that once stood but are now gone. And these went up the value chain. At the beginning, it was T-shirts, it was blue jeans, but 1/3 of our trade deficit with China is in advanced technology products. That's like nuclear technology, biohealth, sophisticated metals. So it is not simply an equation that we're getting cheap T-shirts in exchange for this liberalization. We've had an enormous crisis here for manufacturing.
Thank you, Mr. Paul. I want to turn my attention to Mr. Pottinger for a second. So, Center for Strategic International Studies, CSIS, recently developed a war game simulation for Taiwan, an invasion of Taiwan by the CCP today. And they found that in roughly 24 out of 24 times they ran the simulation, the CCP would fail to successfully invade Taiwan today, and that gaps exist in their capabilities to do what Chairman Xi Jinping has commanded the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, to be able to do by 2027. Can you talk about what some of those gaps are today that Chairman Xi Jinping is trying to address on his side?
Congressman, the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, has been receiving massive amounts of investment that increase by double digits in many years, precisely to try to fill gaps that they would need to fill in order to successfully invade Taiwan. And that's really what we should be working to prevent, is an invasion. It includes things like amphibious lift, more ships that can carry tanks and equipment. It includes more missiles to add already to the thousands of missiles that are pointed at Taiwan. That's very scary because those missiles would cause enormous devastation, but countries rarely submit to airstrikes alone. And so there are other things that they need to do to get people, soldiers on the ground and equipment there. Helicopter lift is another key area, but then also the capabilities that are designed to threaten the United States, to keep us out of the fight long enough for Xi Jinping to make it a fait accompli.
Let me ask you something. In your testimony, you actually quote Chairman Xi in his speech that he gave in November 2021, where he praised Mao Zedong for a preemptive strike on General Douglas MacArthur in 1950. He said, "With one punch, 100 punches will be avoided." Could you envision a scenario of a preemptive attack on America?
It's possible. We know that the PLA is training for the likelihood that the U.S. would be part of the fight, and that raises the escalatory pressure on China to try to eliminate U.S. capabilities right there in the Western Pacific to buy them time. One of the other quotes, because Xi Jinping has been, as you mentioned, telling the Chinese Communist Party to study the Korean War, which they call the war to resist America. He's also said that we in China, quoting Mao Zedong, he says that we should be willing to ruin our own country internally in order to rebuild it anew. So those are the kinds of quotes that don't give me, great sleep at night.
Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Whitman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank our witnesses tonight. And let's begin by, as a committee and as a nation, making one thing clear to everyone around the world. The Chinese Communist Party is a threat to the United States. It is the threat of our lifetime. The CCP actively undermines the U.S. and our world economy. It also attempts to use the principles of our republic against us. Beijing is intent on building a military that not only threatens the world in the Indo-Pacific, but across the globe. Beijing also has no problem in exploiting our financial systems against us. It also illegally seizes natural resources, both here in the United States and with our friends around the world. And insidiously, it attempts to shape the thoughts, the ideas, and the viewpoints of our children through their use of media. And there are many other elements that we can talk about there. Mr. Pottinger, I want to get you to elucidate, why does the Chinese Communist Party seem so intent on challenging the United States? And how does Beijing view America? And maybe most importantly, what are the CCP's vulnerabilities? What are their weaknesses? And what do we have in it as an advantage over the CCP?
Sir, the Chinese Communist Party has viewed us as the primary adversary going back quite a long time, but very clearly around the time of the end of the Cold War. So when the Soviet Union, which had been China's primary adversary up to that point, fell apart, Beijing focused on us as their primary ideological threat, military threat. Chairman Gallagher spoke about the paranoia that really runs through the heart of the CCP, fear that it's going to be subjected to color revolutions, that democracy and freedom might come to their shores in ways that would unseat them. Look, the vulnerabilities are significant. I think the most important vulnerability of all is that the party fears most of all its own people. The Chinese Communist Party fears the Chinese people. And we've seen that on display. We saw it, as Tong Yi mentioned, the recent demonstrations in China where Xi Jinping was unwilling to remove this draconian zero COVID policy of lockdowns, even when it was causing their economy to crater, even when it was not working against containing the virus. And yet, when did he finally give up the policy? It was when those brave young people, many of them young women, who led those protests on the streets of Chinese cities. Once that happened, he gave up the policy overnight and announced that COVID was merely a cold and nothing to worry about. So they're fearful of their own people.
Very good, thank you. General McMaster, we've heard our military leaders over the past 5 years define what they believe the growing threat is of China. We've heard the Davidson window, and now most recently we've heard too, maybe within the next year or two is the window that the Chinese would look to try to take Taiwan. First of all, what would be the cost of that conflict for the United States and others around the world? And we know too that a conflict there would be of a scale that I don't think anybody in this nation realizes. It would be of the scale even greater than, I think, World War II because of the massive amount of power between those two nations. Can you also tell us what would be the cost if we failed to deter the CCP?
Thank you for that question. We are in a difficult position because we have been underinvested in modernization for quite a long amount of time. What has happened is the People's Liberation Army studied us. Yeah. And instead of trying to recreate some of our exquisite capabilities, they developed countermeasures. Tiered and layered air defense, offensive cyber capabilities, counter-satellite capabilities, long-range precision fires. And so what they have done is try to figure out how to take apart what they saw as our differential advantages. We need now, and we've needed for some time, investments in countermeasures to those countermeasures, but we haven't been able to pull it off. We also have problems in capacity at the same time. So I think what Xi Jinping sees is a fleeting window of opportunity, an opportunity to move while he perceives weakness in the United States. It's worth going back and reading the joint statement between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin on the eve of the Beijing Olympics. The message is, hey, the United States, West, free world, you're over. It's a time for a new era of international relations, and we're in charge now. The other factors that I think add impetus to this is really the sense that the frailties in the Chinese economy that they have incurred in their race to surpass us are really beginning to show cracks in the Chinese system. What better way to divert the disappointments of the Chinese people than through jingoistic nationalist sentiment focused largely on Taiwan? There's a Taiwanese election in 2024. It's not going to be good, I think, from the view of Xi Jinping. And then our own election, which we tend to be sometimes fractious during an election, I think he may perceive weakness. If we think of deterrence as capability times will, our capabilities are not where they should be, and capacity, and their perception, which I don't think is right, but the party's perception of our will, I think, makes it a dangerous period.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Ms. Castor is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Tong Yi, thank you very much for being here. Thank you for your bravery, for your defense of human rights, freedom, and democratic values. At the outset of our committee work, what do we as Americans need to understand about Chinese culture, ideology, traditions to help us think about how we strategically compete with the CCP?
I think Chinese people fundamentally are not different from the American people. They all want more freedoms in all aspects of their lives. And the most recent white paper protests showed that desire for living a normal, free life in China. But because of the draconian zero COVID policy, that deprived them of their most basic freedom, such as even get sick at their home and be forced into a quarantine center. So the young people rose up. From the tradition, I wouldn't say, the traditional Chinese would just obey the authority. Look at what Taiwan has showcased us, that the traditional Chinese values, they keep that very well, but they also live in a very vibrant democracy. So Taiwan's example is actually the sword for the CCP. That's why the main reason why they would like to take Taiwan over, to say that the Chinese people only deserve dictatorship, but it's not true. Since 1949, there are multiple movements, freedom movements, such as the Democracy War Movement in 1978, Tiananmen Movement in 1989, and the Hong Kong people's demonstrations in a mass scale in recent years, and also these most recent protests that showcase that Chinese people just have the same values and principles like other Western people.
Mr. Pottinger, under President Xi, the Chinese Communist Party has vastly expanded digital surveillance of the Chinese people. The Chinese people are unable to do anything without the CCP being aware, and I understand that they aim to use all that personal data collected on individuals as a method of social control. I believe Ms. Tong Yi said it's something like a digital dictatorship. If this Orwellian state of affairs is not bad enough, the CCP has dramatically increased the export of surveillance technology abroad. Companies like Huawei, Beidou, WeChat, and others work on behalf of the CCP to route surveillance technology across the globe. Sometimes it's called safe or smart city systems, but in reality, these are tools for authoritarian governments to surveil citizens and repress human rights. But it gets worse. So these companies can gain access to any data these systems collect and hand it over to the Chinese state security. What's your view on this? We're going to need to develop strategies going forward and policies. What is your view, and how bad is it?
Congresswoman, thank you. I think that we need to have a much more rigorous defense and offense. On the defense side, it means that we don't allow those same capabilities that you were describing that are being used to impose what one former Chinese Communist Party official who's now in exile calls an exquisite totalitarianism, right? A digital dictatorship, as you put it. We don't want that to be exported onto our shores to give the Chinese Communist Party the ability to manipulate our own discourse and to steal our data and to silence and intimidate people, as it's already doing through social media platforms here in the United States. On the more offensive side, I would say that we're a free country. We don't need to peddle disinformation or deep fakes, which are now part of the stock in trade of the things that the CCP is experimenting with. All we have to do is connect people. We need to make it easier for Chinese people to connect with the outside world and see news and information flowing in safely without the digital panopticon of the Communist Party looking over their shoulder. And we need to make it easier for them to communicate with one another. I don't think we've tried very hard. So this thing that looks so formidable, I think, is actually made of paper mache. I think you can punch holes in the Great Chinese Firewall. I think we've not made a concerted effort, a public-private effort with Silicon Valley firms leading the way. Let's face it, Silicon Valley firms aren't going to gain access like Google and Facebook and others who've tried years ago to work in China. They've been banned. They have nothing to lose by working for the cause of freedom. And the U.S. government, there's a lot more that we can do in that front as well. I think we haven't gotten started yet.
Mr. Newhouse is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman Gallagher, as well as Ranking Member Krishnamurthy, and I want to thank this evening's witnesses for being with all of us tonight. Just last week, the United States Department of Agriculture forecasted that in 2023, the U.S. would run a record $14.5 billion trade deficit on food and agricultural products. China will remain and has been one of our most significant markets for U.S. agricultural products. However, similar to what we heard from Mr. Paul in his testimony, China has and will continue to treat our American farmers and ranchers unfairly with significant tariffs as well as non-tariff trade barriers. The bottom line is China does not play by the global rules on trade. You might already know this, but entities associated with the PRC as well as the CCP have made and continue to make investments in U.S. agricultural land and assets. Some of the proposed purchases are in close proximity to national security assets. And obviously this is not a good trend for U.S. agriculture. And as I've always said, that food security is literally national security, which could not be more true today than at any point in history. So my question I'll direct to General McMaster first. How concerned are you by the CCP-backed purchases of American agricultural land and those potential purchases near strategic sites such as military installations or critical infrastructure? And then a second part of my question, I don't know if you were involved with CFIUS decisions in your previous role as National Security Advisor, but do you think that CFIUS has the statutory authority to block and should block land purchases by the CCP on national security grounds?
Thank you for that. Thank you for that question. I think I'm very concerned about that, about the purchase of lands and buildings next to sensitive sites. It's extraordinary the degree to which the Chinese Communist Party has pursued a massive campaign of espionage. That's one facet of it. The other aspect, I think, that what you're getting at as well is the dependency on Chinese investment, which then gives them really coercive power. I describe in my written testimony the 3 C's of co-option, coercion, and concealment. Co-opt by trying to build dependencies from U.S. agriculture on the Chinese market. And then, hey, once you're in, then to use that for coercive purposes. The commercial aspect of this is often tied to the United Front Work Department, an arm of the Ministry of State Security, which forms organizations that look innocuous, that promote U.S.-China dialogue and economic discourse in the area of agriculture, in particular in the American heartland. But those are organizations that are designed to advance the PRC's agenda. And then, co-option, coercion, and then to conceal all of this as just normal business practices. So I think you're quite right to be concerned about this, Congressman Newhouse, and I think what you're doing, what the committee's doing to pull the curtain back and shine the light on this behavior, I think is the most important first step.
I appreciate that. Ms. Tong, in the time that I have remaining, and thank you very much for your moving testimony, someone who has lived through a repressive regime in China. In your written testimony, you touch on the courageous individuals in China who participated in the white paper protests just last fall. Could you talk a little bit about what was both similar and different in these protests compared to maybe previous dissident movements in China?
On the similarities, both Tiananmen movement and white paper protests were massive and took place in many large cities. In both cases, young protesters very, very idealistic and felt it's my duty to stand up for more rights and against the totalitarian regime. On differences, the Tiananmen movement lasted for more than 50 days, and the white paper movement just lasted a few days, a couple of days. And the difference is due to the CCP's enhanced surveillance capabilities today and its vastly greater police manpower. The number of the white paper protests was smaller than the 1989 participants. But in light of the enhanced surveillance capacity by CCP, their individual courage, I would say, was greater than the Tiananmen generation. And for the cases that came to light, more women were detained this time than men, it seems, and it is the first time in China. I also want to state this point. Recently, the Chinese government announced it has won a victory over COVID. In fact, the victory should belong to these white paper protesters, whose number one demand was to get rid of the zero COVID policy. So they achieved the result, while the Tiananmen student movement did not. Now the CCP is trying very hard on the internet and on social medias to erase people's memories about their draconian zero COVID policies and measures. If this is not what the white paper protest victory, what should we call it?
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. And I appreciate all of you being here and helping educate us and the American people the challenges that we face from the Communist Chinese Party. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Mr. Carson is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member. This question is for everyone. How do you recommend we ensure the new law imposing limits on importing goods produced using forced labor in China, specifically the Uyghur minority? Is there anything we should be focusing on to ensure that this law is having the desired effect?
Mr. Carson, I'd be happy to take a crack at that. Thank you for the question. The Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act was, I think, a tremendous example of the bipartisan concern. It passed nearly unanimously, had the support of the administration, obviously. Implementation is the key here, and importers are fighting against it every step of the way. But we've seen some results. There have been 2,300 seizures of goods that have been made, and the Customs and Border Protection continues to need to scale up its capabilities here. It is an overwhelming volume that we still see. It should expand the priority areas of concern. Right now, they include polysilicon, tomatoes, some fibers. There's evidence that has been uncovered by researchers that an alarming amount of the automotive supply chain has tentacles into Xinjiang, and most brand name original equipment manufacturers have either subcontractors there, and so metals obviously should be another area of concern. But I think from a congressional perspective, oversight is very important, and ensuring that the importers that are complaining that their goods are being seized need a different business model and shouldn't be depending on forced labor in Xinjiang, because we have to presuppose that any article made from that region is made with forced labor. There's virtually no transparency there that human rights groups have into the atrocities that are taking place.
To that point, Mr. Paul, and this is my final question, in your written testimony, you emphasize the problems stemming from the erosion of U.S. manufacturing capabilities for goods such as EVs and batteries and semiconductors. In many regions, like my own, the Midwest, particularly the great Hoosier State, we have a very strong industrial base. In your opinion, what is needed to reverse this negative trend and bolster American production in these critical sectors?
Thank you again for the question. As a fellow Hoosier, I can relate to your concern about manufacturing, and Indiana has a long and proud history in that, as does Wisconsin, I would quickly add, for the chairman's benefit, and many other states as well. But specifically, it takes intent. And for too long, for decades, we did not have that intent. We had a philosophy, and we also took for granted that China would play by the rules. And so there is no single policy that is going to change this, but it is going to take an all-of-government approach. We're starting to see that take place. We've seen reforms to trade policy. We've been smarter about trade enforcement actions. We've tried to invest in our manufacturing capabilities through offsetting the costs of setting up fabs in semiconductors, and the same with EVs, batteries, and also clean energy, wind, solar as well. But it is going to take that effort along with other competitiveness measures, such as making sure our infrastructure is 21st century and our workforce is prepared to compete. We have to be ready for this reshoring as well. Our trade policy can start it happening, but our competitiveness policies will finish the deal there.
Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. I've been informed there's coffee in the back. We've spared no expense, given the late hour. I can't vouch for the quality of this coffee, but it has caffeine. Mr. Molinar is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member, for this opportunity, and I want to thank all the witnesses as well. Mr. Pottinger, good to see you again. Wanted to ask you, the opioid crisis has killed hundreds, thousands of people, some in my own district. And in your assessment, what is the role of the CCP in contributing to the fentanyl crisis here in the United States, and how should we counter that?
Sir, it's good to see you again. Only a few years ago, China was shipping fentanyl directly into our markets, or into the black market, using the mail. We made progress, the U.S. made progress during the Trump administration in turning back that, and also getting China to classify fentanyl as a controlled substance. But what has now happened is that the Chinese state-owned firms and other companies governed by the party state in China are sending the precursor chemicals in mass quantities to Mexico and perhaps a few other markets, but primarily Mexico, to the drug cartels to create fentanyl that then washes into our streets and kills tens of thousands of Americans each year. The best that you could say is that the Chinese Communist Party is practicing malign neglect in allowing that business to continue. They could stop it if they wanted to, and that's been the judgment of many DEA and FBI officials, former officials. Craig Fowler, an admiral who commanded Southcom for us, also pointed to the fact that China has become the #1, or Chinese organized crime has become the #1 provider of illicit money flows, money laundering flows. And that has fueled the fentanyl trade in the U.S. So there are things that we need to do to really go after those illicit flows of money, and that means updating our Know Your Customer laws and anti-money laundering regulations for banks so that they can identify Chinese organized crime activity and Chinese United Front activity in that area, for starters, sir.
Okay, thank you. You also mentioned that Xi Jinping has called for the deepening CCP control over Chinese companies. I wanted to, and also, Mr. Paul, you had mentioned the CCP fusion strategy and that no business is untainted. I wonder if you could both speak to that situation.
Well, one of the remarkable things that Xi Jinping has ushered in has been really the re-centralization of party control over the economy and over businesses, including private companies. And that's why we've seen the decimation of private companies in China over the past couple of years, the pushing out of the founders of dynamic companies like Alibaba, Jack Ma, who was identified as, really one of the founders of that whole sector. They've been pushed out of their companies. And Beijing has been trying to promote the idea that it's now safe again to invest in China. But in a classic example of dual messaging, we see one message being provided to foreign investors, at Davos. And at the same time, in Chinese language only side notes that are being issued by Xi Jinping, literally simultaneously, he's saying we need to double down and strengthen the party's control over economic activity. And the party now governs the major actions of these companies. They've taken what they call a golden share. So the Communist Party now owns a veto vote on the board of nominally private companies in China.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. I would just add that the military-civil fusion program has been in operation for 9 years. Its goal is to quickly scale up the technological capabilities of the PLA and to use commercial applications to do that. Businesses in China are under an obligation to participate in it. You see many commercial entities in China, state-owned and private, that have research tentacles into the PLA and other defense affiliates there. And you've seen also cases where joint ventures, which have involved U.S. investment, have necessarily had to turn over technology as well. So this is an area, I think, of increasing concern for me and should be for lawmakers. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Moulton is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank our distinguished panel of witnesses for joining us here this evening. Lieutenant General McMaster, the success of Ukraine, NATO, and the principle of the rule of law against Vladimir Putin and his illegal war is a great cautionary tale for Xi Jinping and his stated desire to invade Taiwan. But for all the success of the West in Ukraine, we have to admit that deterrence failed. So in the Pacific, we can't afford to let deterrence fail. How do we prevent that from happening? Like Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping seems to believe his own propaganda. So how do we make our powerful deterrent believable to Xi and the Chinese Communist Party so that they don't draw us into war?
Congressman Moulton, thank you for that question. I think it's through strength, obviously. Peace through strength still works. And that's our defensive capabilities and those of our partners and allies in the region. I think it's immensely encouraging that Japan is doubling its defense investment. I think new formats that encourage defense cooperation, like AUKUS, very encouraging. But I think we have to recognize that we are very far behind. If you remember the run-up to the reinvasion of Ukraine, many people thought, well, we just need to lay out our red lines. We just need to allay Putin's security concerns. But this is a narcissistic view of the world in which we think what we do or what we say is decisive toward achieving the favorable outcome. But both Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping have aspirations that go far beyond those that are in reaction to us. And so, therefore, it's important for us to demonstrate the strength necessary to convince Xi Jinping, leaders in that party, and leaders in the People's Liberation Army that they cannot accomplish their objectives through the use of force. I think the modernization efforts that are ongoing are inadequate, but the direction in policy is starting to turn in the right direction. For example, some basing activity so that we can project power more readily back to the Philippines, for example.
So one of our most powerful components one of the most powerful components of our strength, as clearly demonstrated in Europe, is our partners and our partnerships. But they're not as developed in the Pacific. So you just mentioned the Philippines. What do we need to do to strengthen our allies and their partnership with us?
Well, Congressman Moulton, I think, first of all, we ought to thank Xi Jinping because he's really helping us in this connection with his brazen aggression from the Himalayan frontier to the South China Sea to 1,771 violations of Taiwan's air defense identification zone just last year, many other violations oriented on Japan, on South Korea. And what you would typically hear from our friends in the Indo-Pacific region oftentimes is that, hey, don't force us to choose. Don't force us to choose between Washington and Beijing. But I think it is becoming clear to countries in the region that it's not a choice between Washington and Beijing. It's a choice between sovereignty and servitude. And I think that we see that especially in this vision for the free and open Indo-Pacific, which we owe to the late Prime Minister Abe. And I think that that is building momentum. You know, China has their one belt, one road, but, you know, we are on the side of many belts, many roads.
Mr. Pottinger, what are some of Xi's vulnerabilities?
Well, I think one useful statistic to keep in mind is that China is spending more on its military than the rest of Asia combined, and yet that number is still smaller than the amount of money that Xi Jinping is spending on his domestic security apparatus to surveil and oppress his own people. So it really is fear of his own people. It's fear of losing access to our capital markets. Another vulnerability for him would be losing access to American technology. It's clear that China has not yet achieved this self-sufficiency, self-reliance that he wants to achieve so that he can wield that as a coercive leverage against other countries. So we should not make it so easy. I mean, imagine if we were actually taking more than the baby steps that I think we've taken in the right direction and actually made the Chinese Communist Party sweat for a change, to actually have to fight to try to achieve its vision rather than serving it up on a silver platter. But more than anything else, he's fearful of his own people. If you remember, when he just had a party congress where Xi Jinping gave himself, awarded himself a second decade in power, he had his predecessor walked out of the proceedings and then announced, perhaps secretly at first, had arranged secretly for only loyalists to be elevated to the Politburo, the Standing Committee of the Politburo. So he fears people within his party too. He fears factions. He fears any kind of dissent or even constructive criticism at this point.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. LaHood is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the witnesses for your valuable testimony here today. I also want to thank Speaker McCarthy for creating this committee, and it's frankly long overdue that we put together a committee like this and that it's bipartisan. The CCP fears more than ever as Republicans and Democrats working together to expose the malign activities of the CCP. And what I love about our committee is its members that are serious, substantive, and conscientious members. I want to make 2 points and then ask a question. One is, over the last 2 years, I've been fortunate enough to serve on the Intelligence Committee. And it's become more clear to me than ever that China has a plan to replace the United States. And they're working at it every day. Replace our economy, replace us in technology, replace us when it comes to national security and the military, and diplomatically. Number 2, Mr. Paul, I'm glad you talked about the history of China being led into the global economy. I look back at when we let China into the WTO, and I don't think any of us were in Congress at the time when that happened, but the argument was, bring them into the WTO, they're going to westernize, they're going to reform, they're going to liberalize their ways. And here we are 20 years later, and there's some spotty things that we can find, but I would argue they've really taken advantage, manipulated the World Trade Organization and many of our global economic systems that we have in place. And, you know, we hear a lot from people in DC, particularly in the business community. Well, we need engagement. We need diplomacy, people that apologize for the CCP. But I look at, and it's been alluded to here today, just in the last 4 years here, we've heard about, obviously, in Ukraine, China siding with Putin an unprovoked illegal invasion, right? They talked about an unbreakable bond with Putin. The COVID outbreak. Originally, what did the CCP do? They blamed it on the US Army, right? You look at their deceitfulness when it related to the World Health Organization. You couple that with the wolf warrior mentality and diplomacy that's been put forth across the globe. Democracy doesn't work anymore. That's what she tells people around the globe. It was alluded to by my colleague, Mr. Mollenauer, the fentanyl, a staggering 110,000 deaths last year in the United States. 99% of the fentanyl is coming from precursor drugs from China. We have consistently, over the last 4 years, asked China to do something. They've done nothing. Just yesterday was announced, China in 2022 issued 2 new coal-powered plant permits per week. 104 new coal-powered power plants in there. So they talk about doing stuff on the environment. So I mention all that in those 2 points. Now to my question. Mr. Pottinger, we hear often from Wall Street and corporations and global businesses that are many of our friends that you need to continue to engage. You got to turn the other cheek. We hear, well, China's not North Korea. In the business community and how we deal with them in terms of, their argument, China's going to change. I would just be curious, the video you played was very powerful. What would be your advice as we engage with corporate America that really doesn't like what we're doing up here and is scared and worried?
General McMaster has a phrase, first do no harm, which I could allow him to talk about a little bit. But look, we want to keep channels open with Beijing, particularly high-level channels. One of the reasons we want to do that is that we want to prevent Xi Jinping from making a grave miscalculation. Miscalculations are the things that dictators do, especially when they've been in power for a long time. But we shouldn't kid ourselves, our corporations, well-meaning protesters, whoever it is, we should not joke to ourselves that Beijing has any interest in collaborating with the United States or others in trying to prevent and mitigate serious problems in the world, whether it's drug abuse, whether it's proliferation of weapons, pollution of our oceans, if it's our atmosphere is getting hotter, or pandemics. Usually when you actually take the time to study the causes of these problems, the CCP is usually one of the primary contributors to those problems. It is very rarely, in any kind of a honest way, trying to mitigate against those problems.
General McMaster, if you could reply.
Congressman, thank you. I think that you hit the nail on the head in terms of the false promises of liberalization or cooperation. And what I wrote in the statement for the record is that we do have to take almost a Hippocratic oath. And this isn't just the work of this committee. This is the work in corporate boardrooms to first do no hurt or harm in 3 areas. Don't give the CCP invest in companies that will give them a differential advantage over us militarily. The second is don't compromise the long-term viability of your business and your workers' jobs in exchange for short-term profits. And the third, immensely important, I think, is don't help them perfect their technologically enabled Orwellian police state or commit genocide. I think, as we saw with Russia's reinvasion, the private sector took measures that went beyond what we had done in terms of sanctions on Vladimir Putin and on Russia. I believe that genocide, for example, should be an ESG issue in boardroom discussions across the country.
Thank you.
Mr. Khanna is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to start by saying a word about the protesters. Even though I disagree with them, I respect them. It takes guts to come into the halls of power with a dissenting view. Now, it's not just because I'm a Bob Dylan fan who told congresspeople and senators to heed the call, not block the doorways or block the halls. It's because when we listen to dissent, when we listen to people who question the very existence of the committee, we show by example exactly what makes the United States of America different than the Communist Chinese Party. And Mr. Chairman, I think you did the right thing by asking them to leave. You can't disrupt democratic meetings. But I was told they're in handcuffs outside. I hope they're not going to be arrested simply for speaking their mind. I want to now move on to Mr. Scott Paul. I thought your testimony was very telling about the mistake we made as a country for the last 40 years and basically deindustrializing the nation, saying manufacturing didn't matter. We could just have the MIT folks win the Nobel Prizes and somehow production was not relevant. Your statistics, I just want to amplify them because I had my staff look up after your testimony. We used to make 20% of the world's steel, down to 4%. China's making 57%. We used to make 37% of aluminum, down to 2%. China's at 57%. We used to make 36% of paper, down to 17%. China's at 30%. You can go industry by industry, and I commend your testimony. Here's my question. The Chinese scholar Hu Angang wrote, "The rise of China resembles that of the United States a century ago. China basically incorporated many elements of Hamilton's formula. They copied, in part, what we invented with Alexander Hamilton and the American system." You note in your testimony that China spends 1.73% of its GDP on industrial financing. We're at 0.39%. Would you agree that part of what is going to help us reindustrialize is having some government financing and government purchasing, that the government has to be a partner of the private sector in rebuilding American industry?
Congressman Khanna, thank you for your observations and appreciate the question. I think there is no doubt that the government has to be a partner in this. In a perfect world, the market would work and it would settle things out. We are not in that world, as the Chinese Communist Party has demonstrated. We have a market failure, and we're starting from behind. If we can have public financing to leverage private investment, we will have more success than the Chinese Communist Party because we have more entrepreneurship, we have more opportunity, and there is not state control. There may be state financing, and this makes a difference. We have seen this with the CHIPS Act already. A small amount of money has leveraged $200 billion in private investment in the United States.
I appreciate you saying that, Mr. Pearl, especially as a co-author of the CHIPS Act with Haley Stevens and others, and bipartisan. I appreciate your support for that. And you point out China is putting in $150 billion. Let me just ask you this on chips. You know, I was in Taiwan. We met with Morris Chang and Ben Thompson. One of the things is TSMC is going to lead when it comes to 3mm chips. Intel may lead between 3 and 10mm chips. But when it comes to the actual chips in most of our cars, in most of our refrigerators, in most of our dishwashers, those are 28 nanometer, 50 nanometer chips. Guess where those are being built? In China. I don't want us to make the same mistake on chips where we have the leading edge chips and let every American buy made in China chips for all their consumer goods. Do you think there should be some effort at a CHIPS Act that actually is going to have the chips that are being put in most Americans' products?
Congressman, I think it's essential to expand to that. Not only the array of chips that you mentioned, but also the value chain in semiconductor fabrication, because they have to be tested. They have to be fabricated, as you well know. They have to have printed circuit boards, and they have many components. And for an effective ecosystem to be created for that, you have to bring it here. You have to bring it here, or you have to nearshore some of it as well. You can't rely on China. And the last time we did that, as I mentioned in my testimony, if we're dependent on China for these sources, we end up with supply chain disruptions at worst. We have incredible leverage against us as well in a time of crisis if there's a national security event happening. So yes, I think the scope needs to be expanded.
Thank you.
Thank you. We've asked the Capitol Police for clarification on what happened to the protesters. We defer to them in these matters. They have well-developed SOPs. I'm certainly not pressing charges, nor is General McMaster, so we will get you more information on that. And I appreciate, I was with you in that meeting with Morris Chang. I found it fascinating. Mr. Dunn is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also want to thank the panelists for their excellent testimony. I believe everyone here could tell a story of how the CCP infiltrated their congressional district. And I'd like to tell of one instance that happened in Panama City, Florida. But anyone with a shipyard could be at risk for this. And what I seek to know is, are the Chinese weakening our Navy and our Coast Guard from within? In 2016, a domestic shipyard in Panama City was awarded the U.S. Coast Guard's Phase 1 contract for the first 4 of 25 offshore patrol cutters. These cutters are being completed on time and on budget, despite Hurricane Michael's Category 5 devastation to our region. And the Coast Guard has repeatedly stated that the quality of these ships is as good or better than any they have. In spite of this success, the Coast Guard went on to award the OPC Stage 2 contract to another company, Austal USA, which is the largest shipbuilding contract the United States Coast Guard has ever awarded at $3.3 billion. This is the same Austal that was awarded the contract to build the littoral combat ships for the U.S. Navy.
This is the primary audio circuit for the Reuters live service. This is the primary audio circuit for the Reuters.